Okay, now we're good.
Fine.
Um,
Okay.
so one of the things that the book Worship Without Words, that one stood out to me a lot
Yeah.
because of the different symbols for, Jesus or God or the Holy Trinity, etc. And so I want to take advantage of those symbols and images and incorporate those into the guidelines and like how churches can use those kinds of symbols and illustrations
Yeah.
in the slides that they use. And then the other book, Unceasing Worship, how a point in it talks about how God's creation is kind of crazy. It's not all geometric and symmetrical. And how, like, there's, if you look in a flower field, there's flowers and grass and like everything everywhere, but it's still beautiful and it's still majestic. So I want to take that into advantage as well when I'm doing these guidelines, is making sure that I'm not trying to make these guidelines perfect or
Sure.
totally symmetrical, because nothing can be perfect. And I really want to focus in on that. Um, so basically, where I'm at in the process right now, I did all of my brainstorming and I just finished my sketches. I'm hopefully going to start actual designs in the next few days, depending on when I can update my design media expert, because we were supposed to meet today and then she said, oh, sorry, something came up. And I'm just like, that's okay.
Yeah.
And I was just like, no worries, it's all good. So if it's okay, I'd like to, and they're just basic sketches, so of course they aren't going to show exactly what I'm envisioning. I
Oh,
also
sure.
can't sketch that small. Um, but just to give you an idea of what I'm thinking of, I will share my screen if I remember how to. That would be great.
Sure.
Okay, can you see
There
that?
we go.
Okay. Okay, so I just started off with a few thumbnail sketches just to get the creativity flowing and exactly what I'm thinking. So I know that one of the things that I know I want to stay consistent is that I want to keep this as simple as possible, because I
Sure.
know that one of the things is that if you look at a set of brand guidelines for any kind of company, they're simple to a point, but they can become very complex and somewhat intimidating. I mean, because when do you ever want to, like, if you need feedback on a certain thing, you say, oh, I'll just look up the guidelines. No one really ever does that. And that's a
But
barrier.
I'd say they do if they're memorable,
Yeah,
short enough. If it's
exactly.
more or less a reference guide.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's something that I want to definitely focus on with these guidelines, is keeping it as simple as possible and super friendly, like using friendly language, not like super complex design vocabulary, just saying this is this, just simple, flat out. So that way whoever needs to look at it can understand it pretty easily. So these are basically all the categories that I want to be able to focus on, are the use of color and how it should be used in the church, And part of that will most likely include, because I ended up doing a survey that I got quite a few responses. I got about 30, and many people were very much in the middle, not too many colors,
Who,
uh,
who did you
very
ask?
simple design. Uh, Most people think that technology can somewhat help clarify the message. So it was very much in the middle, which is good because that's what I was hoping that most people would go for. Because that's how I personally feel. I don't like, let's say for lights, the lighting in the room, if it's too dark or too light, then I feel as if I'm not in a space where I feel like I can truly like deeply connect in a way. And that's all based on emotion. Uh,
Right.
so I know that I want to focus on the use of color, the use of space, which is the organization of the room environment as well as how lights are used. Um, Biblical symbols and imagery, why it's important, and uh, how it can be used in the church, various shapes and text, and why that's important and its use. And a lot of this is based on articles and blogs, that because there's not very much scholarly research done on this. So for
Sure.
me, my scholarly research was articles and blogs, and there's so many out there that say this is what you can do for presentations. So there's a lot of information out there. It's just all over the place, and so it would be beneficial to have just one thing that many churches can use. um, and then there's like a big portion where I would focus on the use of the colors, text, and images in the worship slides, varying from what worship song slides would look like, announcement slides if necessary, the welcome and farewell slides that are at the beginning and the end of the service, and then sermon slides slash sermon series, depending on what a church is focusing on at that time. And then just visual examples of what the guidelines would look like in place. So not just what the slides would look like, but the whole room. And then so those would be the guidelines. And then the second part would be, I was going to use the church that I go to right now as my foundation for saying, okay, now I'm going to put these guidelines in place in an actual space. However, after discussing with my professors, they said that it would be more beneficial and meaningful if I made my own space within a 3D program, because all church spaces are different. So
Sure.
they recommended using a 3D program and making my own virtual 3D video. So that way people could have just like, it's just an example of what the guidelines could possibly look like actually in a space. So those were my thumbnail sketches, and then these are just more detailed sketches, uh, based on the results I got back from the survey. One of the shapes that really stood out from all the responses was the triangle, because a lot of people associate that shape with the Holy Trinity.
Right.
So I know that I want to especially incorporate that shape into whatever I design, as well as foliage, because the point that was said in Unceasing Worship about how God's creation isn't symmetrical, that part really stood out to me, and so that's what inspired for me to focus on doing foliage. and focusing on God's nature of creation of nature. That's what I meant to
Okay.
say. Um, so I mean, I have a few examples, like really simple sketches. Um,
Can I ask who did you survey?
so I sent it out. I mean, I first sent it out to my family, uh, but I don't know who all I got because I get individual responses, but it's not required for them to put their names.
Like,
But
how did they find it?
I sent it out through Google Forms.
Okay.
So, and then I mean, I also put my survey out on a couple of different church Facebook pages, but as far as I know, I haven't gotten any responses from those, which, to be honest, wasn't entirely surprised about. So I've just been trying to reach out to as many people as I know who go to evangelical churches and
Right.
just say, hey, if you could fill out this form, and then if you have anyone that you know that would like to fill it out too, please do, please share.
Yeah.
I just want to get as many responses as possible. I so yeah, so oh, well that works. And then this is part of where I got my inspiration from because I love how God works in creation because with how even his even nature has somewhat of a geometry to it,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is amazing. And I know that something that I used to love to do when I was in high school was take objects such as trees or uh, like fruit and make them into geometric looking, like they still look somewhat realistic, but they were made out of geometric shapes. And
Right.
so that's kind of where that inspiration came from also. So this, I haven't made my mood board yet, but let's say that this is my mood board. And so basically my inspiration for where I'd like the design to lead, very simple, not overly like really detailed. Yeah. So that is where I'm at right now. Do you have any input or feedback for me?
So every time I'm looking down, I'm taking notes. Um, so I know I wrote at least the titles of the 10 things. So, oh man. So I think the three, the three that are most intriguing to me and the three that I think are the most needed
Okay.
are 3 through 5. So use of color, color psychology, use of space, and especially to help. And I get it, like so I might go one further and say I think guidelines are important, but Michaela, I also think the evangelical church needs a book. You're welcome. But like how many people are really going to go through, because it's overwhelming, are going to go through like just combing through in all the sea of information,
Right.
um, for there to be something out there to help people think through and not just sense their way through. Like, I don't know, does this feel too bright? Is this not? Because
Right.
guidelines or whatever else can give a good head start.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, you're right. It is a world of judgment calls, but here's how to reduce them and not be so overwhelmed. Like,
Yes.
these are the things that are normal.
Yes. What was the You didn't say guidelines earlier. It was a different term that you used.
I think I said quick reference.
Yes, I'm gonna write that down because I I completely agree with you with how.
Well, let me give you one example with the quick, where something like a quick reference comes in. Um, think of like first aid, right? Like when you're in a situation where you need to remember, like let's say with an infant, have you ever heard of like you have to do back blows? Like, so what do? Oh yeah, remember like with an infant, like you don't want to do the
Yep.
full slap like that you might do with an adult. Oh yeah, and like you're
Yeah,
not gonna read an essay.
right.
um, and I'm aware that these things are not quite as emergency situations, but for it to be more useful in that moment, unless you're just studying, to be able to say, oh yeah, I need to think about space, and these are the variables
Mhm.
in terms of my environment. That'd
And
be really useful.
I like the term quick reference better than brand guidelines, mainly because, I mean, from my personal experience and designing brand guidelines, those are very specific and
Okay.
that you have to follow. So, like, let's say you have brand guidelines for a company or a church, you have to follow specific guidelines for, like, you have to use the logo this way. But that's not what I want from this. I want to be able to use this as a quick reference. I want to be able to give people a resource that will just help them. And I mean,
Yeah.
part of what I want to include is just like a quick page of just saying, reminding the church that this is going to be a bit, I mean, it's part of what I've been learning in my leadership class too. So that's part of what has made a huge impact. I love my leadership class.
Huh.
Um, but just that knowing you have to be able to know that change can't happen overnight. It's not something that can happen like that. It takes time. And not only that, it takes time for your target audience because they have the fear of maybe losing something. You need to be able to acknowledge their loss. So I want to be able to incorporate with the simple uh, language just by saying, I know that I know this isn't going to change overnight. And I know that this is going to be hard. But I do believe that if we as the church are willing to change and make an impact, we can really change the church for the better visually.
Yeah. And here's what I'd say. I think the biggest value that I see for whatever you call this project, the biggest value that I see is it could help churches enter into this thoughtfully and intentionally, because I think one of the bigger things that sneaks in that people honestly, I'm not sure how aware they even are, is how much the church has like used from the business world, or like a business model. And as an example, I realize I'm making two separate statements here. So there's that, but that can impact a lot of things. The second thing like this is that it's in that book Rhythms of Grace, but I know it's not the only book that has this one.
Mm, right.
This is not the only book that tackles a concept like this. It's that whole question, like, is church more of a banquet hall or a concert hall?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, there are elements of performance, but I think that far too many churches just kind of entered through like, well, yeah, this is what theaters do, or this is what
Right.
whatever, but without thinking through, who are we? Who is this specific fellowship? What are we called to? And because there are some things that every church is called to, like
Mm-hmm.
that's the same thing. And then there's other things. Are you still at oh my goodness, was it called South Suburban? North? No, I'm getting my Denver and Chicago confused. What, are you at the same church you were at years ago in
Oh, Southern Gables.
Southern Gables? Not even close.
Well, I mean, I don't know what it's going to be called though, because they're changing the name of it.
Okay. There was a church near Trinity called North Suburban. So somehow I
Oh, okay, gotcha.
yes. Um, does that make sense? Like how you can enter if you're not careful, you can say, well, this is what everyone else is doing, and like, oh yeah, isn't it cool to not have windows or to have windows, or like, why does it have to be about what's cool? Let's go into like what will be effective,
Hmm.
like because this kind of behind the scenes stuff matters as far as our actual mission,
Right.
you know. And I think the biggest up, if there's an uphill battle, the biggest battle is getting, frankly, church leadership to give a rip, because I think honestly, it's hard to help people think artistically who are not naturally
Yeah.
like biased that way.
Hmm.
And I don't even mean biased as a bad thing in this
Oh yeah, of
case,
course.
you know.
Yeah, I mean, I know that's something that I've experienced with the church that I go to, is that I have a lot of ideas that could really help them out, at least
Uh-huh.
visually, with connecting. I mean, the church that I go to is very more of the older generation goes, and they've been trying to get the younger generation to attend for years and haven't been that successful. And I've had ideas for them, but
Right.
they just don't see it the same way.
Sure.
It's like, I really want to say something right now, but I won't. But I mean, something that was also interesting with the survey that I did, it was pretty balanced between one side or the other, where some people would say, uh, like, technology can be effective if you subtly, in like discussing how, the older generation isn't, they didn't grow up with technology. So they're more used to a traditional service where someone said, on the other side, younger generations have grown up with technology and are visually stimulated as a result. If we don't embrace technology, we're not creating an engaging experience for younger generations. And this particularly explains in my mind why there is a drop in church attendance.
And what's funny is you'll also find people who say, you know what? I'm surrounded by visual stimulation everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So can't church be the one place that's humanizing?
Yeah,
So it's
exactly.
one of
And
those, you're going to lose almost no matter what you do. In other
oh,
words, if your target is to please everybody, don't even bother.
oh yeah. Well, and that's why
If you're
both of my professors suggested that I narrow down my target audience, because I was
sure.
just saying my target audience are evangelical churches. And they said that I either needed to focus on the younger generation or the older generation. And I told them that I wouldn't, because
Well, the reason they're wrong, and sorry, professors, if you're going to watch part of this, but the reason they're wrong is that the church is the church. The
I
church is
think,
family.
thank
You
you.
can't do that.
I was saying
Any church
that's
that is,
exactly what I told them.
any church that is, white dudes that are age 35 named Aaron is not much of a church.
Right.
Putting that out there.
No, that's the exact point that I made. It was the fact that what makes up the church is everyone. I can't seclude one generation over the other. I mean, why do you think sometimes it can be so hard to do a lot of different things for the church? Because if your goal is to make one generation over the other happy, then you're not doing a successful job
Right.
at bringing the church together. So I definitely made that point to them, and they were just like, okay. And I was just like, okay.
Right.
I'm so glad we're on the same page. I love this. I just thought it was crazy. And like when they said that, I was so shocked. And I mean, I shouldn't have been because I should have known that they probably would have said something like that because they're not religious. They don't understand.
Right.
It can be difficult trying to get such a I mean, I do love that CU Denver is diverse, but one of the hard parts is that it's diverse. And so people just don't understand. So through this whole thesis process, every time I present another like progress report, they're just like, "Oh, nice." And then with everyone else's presentations, "Oh, I love what you're doing." It's just like,
Right.
"Okay, I think mine is pretty great too."
Yeah. So you
Yeah,
got to be thick-skinned.
yeah. But I just thought it was interesting how there was just like a pretty even balance of saying like you need the like you need the right balance of technology. And I'm just like, exactly. Thank you. I'm so
Right.
glad that you said that.
Well, one, I guess, if there's a reminder I can give you based on your own experience, would be DT.
Yes.
Do you remember? Like
Yeah.
one of the things. So I'm gonna show you two things real fast. Now don't use this as anything cool because it's not. This
Okay.
is I really do try to think with an eye for beauty, but lots of things that I do are also like just get it done. Like pragmatism. So do you remember?
Yeah.
There's
I remember
that's
that.
it's the one sheet. But my reason to bring it up, what has this tends to happen almost every year. At some point in the year, and I have to keep going back and reminding people, is none of us should try to speak for all of us. And so
Mhm.
I don't quite mean that as a super cool t-shirt. What I mean is that I think the church, because we're humans, consistently disproves any sort of weird theory that, oh, because you're in your 60s, you must like this kind of music.
Mhm.
And like DT time and time again has proven that to be a poor way of approaching the world. Um, we can learn some things, like you can look around the table and say, how interesting that the youngest ones around the table voted this way and the oldest ones voted this way.
Mhm.
That doesn't mean it's going to happen for every song, but you can learn trends. So I'm not saying, oh, it's all relative,
Right.
but I mean, even in terms of visual, any of these areas, use of colors, text, images together, in the same way that you can find lots of people your age and in a similar stage in life, you're just not all going to think the same. So I'm going to stop beating the dead horse, but just that's, I think, the biggest reason why approaching it generationally.
Oh yeah.
The
No,
reason why it's done, refuge does have a good amount of old people,
that's
and you wouldn't think so because it's super dark. What were you
that's
going to say?
great.
But that's because I don't. Okay, as a final word for my pseudo rant, do you remember the name Keith Getty? Keith
Somewhat.
and Kristen Getty wrote "In Christ Alone."
Right.
Yep, and they've written lots of other songs. I don't, I don't know that he, I don't know that this quote comes from him. It's just he's the first one I heard say this, and that is, "A mature Christian is easily edified."
Hmm.
And the point of that concept, I think, would be you look at someone like Dick and Carol Gott, and yeah, they're going through hard things like everybody else, but they're also going to be in. Like while they're here, they've learned to be present, and they've I think found a way to like release oh boy, if it doesn't look like this or sound like this, then I'm out.
Mhm.
Uh, and I wish I could be more like that. So I don't mean all like whatever. I just mean overall, like everything's a bill curve, and so there are going to be people. And if your goal is to use environment and space and color, um, and change, all of these things to help us see and savor Christ, which it sounds to me like that is your goal. There are some who are going to get it and are going to say, absolutely, I am,
Mhm.
like, I'm more and more on board. There are others who are going to say they don't get it, but they don't realize you actually do.
Mhm.
Can't articulate it. Um, that happens with our songs all the time,
Oh yeah, I bet.
because there's like the long play that you have to have, in mind of we're doing these things to affect long-term change. And one of those ways that I will say is when we first started making confession like a weekly thing, there were several in our church who were pretty nervous. And that is now the number one thing that people come to me about and say, I am so grateful. I am so grateful, that we talk about our sin because it reminds us of the good news of the gospel, like something like that. And that part is really affirming in my own heart.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I'd have to say that that's one of my favorite things too. I wish that Southern Gables would do that, where people would just tell their stories and just say, this is where I used to be and this is where I am now because of God. And
Yeah,
like I mean there's people that I know that say they don't have a story, and I'm just like, yeah, you do. I
totally.
that's that's how my boyfriend is he he's told me that he's never been through anything very traumatic in his life. Even if he hasn't, he still has a story.
Absolutely.
And
But
like
you think being rescued from darkness into light, like that's a huge story. Come on.
I mean,
Colossians 1
not
is
everyone.
crazy.
Yeah, I mean, sure, maybe someone's story is a little bit more traumatic than others. That doesn't mean that they're any less valuable,
Right.
or less meaningful. But like how you were talking about, you can't base things on generations. My boyfriend is also a great example. He's 6 months younger than I am, and he loves old movies, old music, you name it. He doesn't really go for anything modern. And so he's one of the kinds of people that, I mean, he does tech almost every week, so that's part of it, but he just doesn't really sing or anything during worship time. And that honestly kind of upsets me just because I
Sure.
don't understand how he can't. But I know I'm at a different place than he is.
Right.
So I give him grace. I'm not judging him for where he's at. He's on his own journey.
Yeah. So the advice, I guess, with the guidelines and stuff is it's really tricky to walk this line, but to keep walking the line that is getting individuals and churches toward what are the judgment calls. That makes sense? Kind of like how in DT, like you have to say, this this is what you need to think through. This is how to evaluate lyrical excellence,
Mm-hmm.
you know, um, compared to where I think some people might quickly discount, even if that's not your intention, but they might discount things, is if you are, I guess, intentionally, accidentally making statements like intentionally, accidentally, who says that? If you walk into the area, like let's say when you were showing the kind of like the geometry in creation, but if you were to say no, the the best way to do this is to have uh, triangles, and you used the words out of my head. Foliage. That's the word you used.
Oh, yeah.
But almost like if you made a statement that I know you wouldn't agree with, but a statement that said you have to have these at all times.
Mhm.
In other words, like if you are as kind of clear as you can be of like, this is what I love,
Mhm.
or this is what's meaningful to me, but what works for you, without it being like, hey, but puppies, man, if that gets you going. No, puppies, how in the world could you be intentional with that? Stop it.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like there is, it's not just relative. There are principles that you are finding. It's just you've got to find a way to communicate those principles without making it sound like, look, the lights need to be this kind of bulb and it needs to be this, or it won't honor God. And
It's just like, how do you know that?
right,
based on
right,
based on what research? Yeah, no, I completely agree. And that's why part of what I'm including in the the quick reference is examples of like what to do, but also what you can and cannot do, if that makes
yeah,
sense.
that really does. Yeah,
Yeah, so yeah, so it's not like I'm saying you have to do it this way and that's the only option. Like that's not what it depends on the church. Like I'm not going to force you to use triangles in all of your presentations. I just want to be able to give as many suggestions as possible based on the research that I've done and
right,
based on what the Bible has to offer.
right. It's critical thinking.
Yeah. But let me just write something down really fast before I forget. Um, is there? I mean, that's pretty much it on my end. Uh, do you have
No,
any other kind of input or feedback for me?
um, I mean, obviously, I'm looking still at like 10,000 feet. Without like a lot of specifics.
Right.
But I think two more things that you're dead on with. Um, that first, man, choices. I remember for a sermon, it doesn't really matter, so I'm gonna stop trying to think of which sermon it was. But it was. I remember I went and I counted, and at City Market there were 38 options for orange juice. 38. It's just orange juice. Um, but so in that same way, like you're right, like the having to try to pick, especially for like I've never been at a church that had I have to look it up again what it's even called, but more environmental projection and not just the screen background. It might just be called environmental projection.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
um, and I've kind of always been alone in making decisions. I do have one thing that you probably have thought of, but I don't know where it would fit. Is this if it's a moving background, which a lot of things are, they're called motions, but
Yeah.
the speed really matters.
Yep.
Um, anyway, I was gonna say lots of choices, and so like helping make it easy, but without like, wow, those choices are super lame, is helpful. But then I think besides each, I'm calling it chapters because in my own brain I approach everything like I'm writing a book, a
Yeah.
persuasive paper. But like your chapter 10, the encouragement of change in church, um, that's one, whether or not for this specific project right now, like for the thesis, like if this goes further
Mhm.
than thesis, I think the biggest encouragement that I can give is to like do some prayerful research and conversations. Like, what is what's it look like for what's it look like to be in something for the long haul, or change that is incremental. Because like I guess one way for me that I've thought about it, and I could be wrong, but I often approach change as there's basically two ways to do it. One is the band-aid, like you just got to do it right now, and it's the overnight, and you just some change is actually really helpful like that. This is exactly when we're doing it. But I think that most change probably is you in your own heart, of course, you would sure like to just do it. It's kind of like if I could just download or upload, whatever term I want to use, if I could just push a button and make our church know some songs, I would do it. Just be done with it. Um, but you can't.
Right.
It's that question of almost if helping people dream and think like who could we become, 5-10 years down the road. And what gives me a lot of hope with these things that I see from you is color and space, environment, symbols, imagery. Um, they have a shaping influence on us, even if we don't realize they do.
Mhm.
So, absolutely, is this worth it? Yeah. And I think that's more. It's not change for the sake of change, but that might be the kind of. So I'm going to stop and say one thing, and stop trying to hack my way into it. I think that might be something like that is probably the way in to helping people who don't naturally think artistically. Like this is what's at stake. So maybe that's the question. What's at stake if you don't think this way or don't pursue these things? Is your worship still acceptable to the Father? Of course, if it's because of Christ's work on your behalf. But in the same way, if worship is about the heart, it doesn't just end with the heart.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Like there's enough, like isn't sincerity enough? That's a big argument in worship matters, of course.
Mhm.
Yes and no. So I'm excited. I think you've done, even if you won't hear it from professors, and I get it. Like if if you don't have professors who live in this part of this world, um, how could they understand?
Oh yeah.
Not because they're dumb, but because they don't experience it.
Yeah. And I mean, they're not my target audience. So
Right.
I don't entirely mind what their opinion is.
Yeah.
They're not my focus. Uh,
Yeah. Cool. This is exciting.
I'm very excited for this. I'm gonna be excited once I start getting into designing things. I don't remember. I thought I was gonna say something, but maybe not. Hmm.
Oh, I've got one more category,
Yeah.
and I'm sure you thought of this one too. But you want to know one of the biggest hurdles for something like this in a lot of churches?
Okay.
Budget.
Oh yeah. Mhm. Yep.
But what I mean is not even necessarily that you don't have the money. It's that, like, let's say there was something we wanted to implement this coming year, because our fiscal year is really awkward. I think. Why would we do April to March? What a weird. Can I get a time machine and slap somebody, please? Like, don't do that. Um, but but I didn't like if we, for example, were to make many changes that involved things that actually cost money. I didn't ask for the money when I turned in my stuff. So in other words, like for something right here, that's a if I didn't think about it at budget time, we're in trouble.
Mhm.
But that's only a 1 year thing compared to. Does that make sense? Like how quite often, like around the staff table, like we might have this, oh man, like we could do this really fun, like big church meal, whatever, and then we have to determine we're gonna have to take the money from this category over here because none of us thought about it.
Mhm.
Or shoot, well, we don't have the money this year. And it's a great, in other words, I'm saying people can affirm a really good idea, but it didn't line up with their priorities
Yeah.
at the time. So I don't mean it as a big chapter. I mean it as a what's another hindrance.
Mhm. No, yeah, that is something that I actually spent quite a bit of time researching. Just because I know that they're just based on prior knowledge. I know that there's a difference visually between a local slash small town church versus a mega church.
Of
And
course.
why do mega churches use all of this, flat, colored lights and flashing everywhere, and like you're looking like a concert, versus like, Eat Free and Canyon, where you don't really use that. And yet, like, we're still, I mean, I'm still able to worship at your guys' church. So, and like
It
one,
never, it never makes me feel good to hear you say your guys' church.
well, hey, that's the first time I've said that ever. I normally, like, I still consider
Even
Eat Free my home.
I'm gonna say, even if you never move back,
Oh, it's still gonna be my
okay,
home. I don't
there you go.
still gonna be my home. I don't care. Um, but yeah, I mean, one of the things that I ended up researching was, um, not darn it, I lost it. I had it and then it just gone. I don't remember what I was gonna say. That's
Well,
okay.
if you think of it, you know where to find me.
Oh yeah.
But I'd say I've got one more question,
Okay.
and it's related to the thesis.
Okay.
Do you, and maybe this is making the scope too big, which I'm famous for those things. So just smile and nod, and let's.
Okay.
Um, because you brought up this church building, how do I phrase the question? So some decisions that are made in the actual church architecture, right? And so, like for us, the big, massive window in the sanctuary, like what's weird is I'll bet you more people, like if we were to put out a simple survey, like, hey, would you rather we keep the curtains open or closed during our times of gathered worship? I don't even think it'd be close. I am sure that most people would say absolutely open.
Mhm.
That's why I go there.
Yeah.
But but the question I'm asking is, do you think that you would have like in your like in talking about environment or colors, thoughts for what to do with rooms that are super high in natural light?
Mhm.
So like for
I
us as a,
yeah.
go ahead.
I honestly, I have thought of that. I mean that uh and I'm still stuck on it.
Sure.
Um, I don't know, maybe I mean, do you do you have any suggestions?
No,
Just
I mean, there's
all churches are different. I mean, Southern Gables, where their sanctuary is in the physical building, there's no windows on any of
right,
the walls. So of course it works for that room to be a little bit darker because there's no natural light for to enter. Whereas with E free there is a natural window and that works for them.
kind of.
Kind of.
It works. Well, here's the deal. I'd say it works, but it also handcuffs us. So
Hmm.
like I have to work pretty hard for a blackout.
Hmm.
Not only it's not just closing the curtains. Like I have to get up there and hang. I don't even know if that I'll call it fabric for now, but hang this. I have to safety pin stuff to the very tops of the curtains to get a true black. Like it's just ridiculous in that room. I just know it's one of those interesting things as far as architectural trends. I don't know what people are doing now. Like if people are more building what's called the black box the black box, or if they are building sanctuaries with natural lighting. Uh,
Hmm.
evening services like refuge, I at least have a little bit of control over the environment because I can close the curtains.
Yeah.
And so like during Advent, I did close the curtains. And I know that's kind of weird. I did that for 2 weeks and then we undid it. So it's not that I necessarily have input, it's that what too much natural light can do is almost say, well, what's the point of using other lights when you can't see them?
Right.
um, I will say that probably the one of the biggest things that we do, and I'll stop now with my just random feedback on stuff, is that because we have so much natural light, I might be harder on our guys in the booth than I need to be, but I'm pretty aggressive on I don't want much from our actual lights. Like we need enough house lights for people to see their Bibles, but
Right.
I'm just always concerned we're too bright.
Hmm.
Like I don't it's almost a problem. Like
Yeah.
it's hard to get it to where it feels appropriate and not just blinding. Like one
Right.
super quick example was the 11 o'clock service this past week. And the way the sun was reflecting off of the snow on the ground, it was sun onto snow and
Oh,
snow onto the walls. It pretty much took out the vocal side screen. It was just you couldn't see anything,
wow.
which whatever. But that's
But I mean, because since we're all human, we notice the littlest things. So, like,
right.
I mean, honestly, if I would have been there and I couldn't see the lyrics on the singer's side unintentionally, I probably would have been thinking, well, that's kind of bothering. I can't see anything.
Well,
Uh,
and what's funny? Well, I noticed it as we start because it wasn't there at 9:30.
oh,
So as we were starting, and it's because I looked at the wall and thought, "Uh-oh." And if I could have just had a telepathic conversation with somebody, I would have sent them to go close the curtain, or at least half of it. Find which one is blocking our
yeah.
vision.
Give someone like hand signals or a secret
Right.
code.
Yeah.
But that
Yeah.
that is something that I have highly considered including. I would like to do a little bit more research and
Sure.
how that would.
I only meant like because people, you're right, there's lighting, there's everything,
Mhm.
but how do you get sure anybody who might be reading your thing to not check out and they're like, oh, lighting, that doesn't matter to us. We our lighting options are off and on. Like, not necessarily.
Right. Right. Exactly. No, I
Do you
completely
have
agree.
preference?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I really think that's where the style of language comes in. Is like I can have as many images as I want in the reference, but I still need to have a kind of language with whatever is in the reference that won't have people saying, well, this is boring. So I'm still figuring out that part. But because basically the way our thesis is working now, and our professors just told us this a couple of weeks ago, was that we're able to present in person, but we have to do it in two separate groups. So for me, I have to be done with my thesis on April 14th, which is less than a month from now.
Right.
Trying not to freak out. But if it's at all possible to meet with you at least one more time before then, because at that point I would probably want to go over maybe some of the uh, actual designs that I've made in one of the Adobe programs like Illustrator to get feedback.
I would say if it's possible, and if it's not, that's okay.
Mhm.
But if it's possible to wait until after April 5th, that would be great.
Because that's
April 4th is Easter,
right.
but I'm just aware that I'm going to be useless on April 5th.
Okay. I will
So
make a note of that. I don't want to forget that. And honestly, that'll probably be doable. I mean, because how we're presenting it, we could have either done a like presenting our thesis on an iPad, or we have all of our information printed out on like a huge banner. Well, I chose a banner, so I have to have things done a little bit earlier so that way there's enough time to print it through a company. I don't remember the name of it,
yeah,
but after April 5th should be fine. As long as I have mostly everything done, it should be good.
cool.
Okay. Sweet. Well, thank you for taking time out of your day to meet with me. This was very informative.
Yeah, I'm excited. I think it's going to be good.
Okay. Well, that's all I have. So if you don't have anything else, then I will let you know when I want to meet with you again. Okay,
That sounds great.
sweet. Well,
Okay, thanks.
I hope that you
I'm
have
here.
a good rest of your day.
Yeah, you too. We'll see you later.
See ya.